What do the following people have in common? Jean-Luc Picard, Yahya Sinwar, Don Giovanni, Yannick Sinner, Ivan the Terrible, the Jonas Brothers, and Evan Wyant from middle school. Answer: they all have the same name. Look again. They all bear variations of the Hebrew name Yochanan, in English our common John. Multiple times in my life, I've suddenly realized that a foreign name with which I was familiar was actually just their version of John. Yochanan in Hebrew ultimately became Juan in Spanish, Ian in Scottish, and my most recent revelation, João in Portuguese. Not sure I pronounced that correctly. It's my best effort. Yahya is Arabic, Giovanni Italian, Yannick Germanic, Ivan Russian, Jonas Lithuanian, Evan Welsh. To make matters more complicated and therefore more fun, some versions of John became so common in given places that they spilled over into nearby languages that already had their own version of John. Shane is an anglicized version of the Irish Sean, which is their version of John. A little aside, one of the coolest things about English is that the same French word sometimes entered it twice at different times and in different forms. Vanguard and avant-garde provide an example. My own surname, Ward, came in as Ward from one part of French and came in as Gard from another area of France where they pronounced that initial consonant differently. In the original Hebrew, Yochanan meant God has been gracious. The name of the female character, Hannah, the mother of Samuel, is still baked into the Hebrew name for John. You just have to tack a version of Yahweh on the front of Hannah and you get John. Not so incidentally, that stray H in there, a letter we don't pronounce, is left over from the Hebrew like a vestigial organ. The closest any modern language gets to Yochanan is German, presumably following an earlier Latin form with its Johannes. It's from this form that Hans is derived, and because YouTube doesn't charge me anything to store longer videos on their service, I will add that Hansel, the little boy who killed the witch in Grimm's fairy tale, is a diminutive version of Hans. The EL on the end is kind of like our Y. Jim becomes Jimmy in English. Hans becomes Hansi, as it were, Hansel in German. This linguistic situation is utterly fascinating to me and totally unacceptable to a lot of people. It's the kind of thing up with which they shall not put. But I don't mean they refuse to call people John or any of its equivalents. No, they don't know or care about John in my experience, these people. He can take a hike from Lithuania to Wales for all they care. What gets their linguistic dander up is James. They insist that James should be Jacob. This is because, and this is true, the English name James began its life as the Hebrew name Yaakov, that we know as Jacob. This name is introduced to us as some kind of pun. In Genesis 25:26, Jacob was named after the heel, the Hebrew akav of Esau that he grabbed on his way into this world. To call James James is to obscure his all-important connection to the patriarch. In my experience, most of those who are pushing for the book of James to be the book of Jacob in our New Testaments are not careful to articulate a consistent rationale for their preference for Hebrew forms over English ones. Jacob over James. These folks are often shrill, I must say, and conspiratorial. But I did find one biblical scholar who argued that using James obscures a connection between the Old and New Testaments and diminishes the Jewishness of the latter. Those are serious arguments worth answering. Now, I have buried the lead under multiple languages here, but I've done it for a good purpose. I'm trying to get past some pretty watchful dragons. I'm trying to make a point I don't see anyone else making. It's this: pushing the way Christians talk and write back toward Hebrew is as linguistically impossible as it is theologically undesirable. You simply cannot be consistent with the push back toward Hebrew sounds and forms for several reasons. One is that you'll never get it right. Your ancient Hebrew accent is horrible, you American. And how was Hebrew pronounced anyway? Surely there were regional dialects in which their version of Jacob was pronounced at least a little differently. Today, John sounds a bit different in Michigan, Minnesota, and Manchester. I will try to do it. John, and John. And don't forget the Old Testament story in which dialectal variation led to the death of 42,000 Ephraimites in Judges 12, and to our English word shibboleth, which we, ironically, have our own way of pronouncing. Another reason is that you'll never translate or transliterate often enough to satisfy some people. What is the logical end of insisting that James is really Jacob? that Jesus is really Yeshua, that the Lord is really Yahweh, that peace is really Shalom, that Sabbath is really Shabbat, that slander is really Lashon Hara. The logical end is just going all the way and speaking biblical Hebrew instead of English. But if we're allowed to say any religious words in good old English, why not all of them? James is the product of exactly the kind of linguistic evolution we saw at the beginning of this video with John. Language changes over time, including pronunciation. And in the mealy mouths of the medieval French, the kob in the middle of Latin Jacobus ended up becoming the letter M. If this sounds impossible to you, listen to yourself pronounce Israel. You will likely switch the vowel sounds around in the middle. Israel rather than Israel. Now, imagine that spelling ended up following pronunciation, as it often does. Suddenly, you get Israel, Isreal, and you get James. Then the French conquered England, which this Anglophile would rather not talk about, and now we English speakers say James instead of Jacob. A combination of human physiology and historical contingency gave us the linguistic situation we have, just like it did with literally all of our words and all of our grammar. Nobody speaks Proto-Indo-European anymore. Admittedly, the patriarch Jacob is still Jacob in English, not James, but this too is just the way the baguette crumbles. Spanish too has multiple versions of this name, from Iago, and so Santiago in Chile is Saint James, to Diego, to Jaime, and Jacobo. Going around telling native speakers of any language, "You are saying it wrong," is generally not considered polite. A footnote and an occasional preaching point may be all we need. And efforts to move wholesale from James to Jacob won't be effective, or so I believe. Mark Wilson suggests that if Bombay, Peking, Burma, and Rhodesia can become Mumbai, Beijing, Myanmar, and Zimbabwe, then James can become Jacob. And I can't deny that this is possible. I just don't think it's going to happen. If you try to make it happen, you'll get a tiny tribe of people to agree with you and to start 1,000 unnecessary fights online with other bemused or bewildered Christians. A certain cast of mind loves to find out hidden truths that other people don't know, especially if shady, malign forces can be blamed. Anti-Semitism, tradition, for the truth's hiddenness. But you won't alter the course of the massive USS English language, let alone the HMS English language and Kenyan and Australian versions of the same basic ship. The New Testament authors had the definitive chance to show the Greeks the right way to pronounce the true names of God or of Jesus or of James. Greek Jakobos already includes multiple sound changes away from the Hebrew original, even if it is closer to it than James is. Instead, the New Testament writers used the forms of those names that were available to them in Koine Greek, and they incorporated the natural sound changes that have ultimately put a z and not a schwa in the middle of the English name of Jesus. Standard Koine Greek did not have a zh or a sh letter like Hebrew did, so Greek used its closest equivalent, basically our letter S. This is what all languages do. They anglicize, gallicize, Russianize, Turkify, Urdunate. Note, that last one was not a word, and it shouldn't become one. And somehow, people from all these nations managed to worship the one true God and his Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. They're not all saying it wrong. A few months ago, I got one intelligent answer to my basic argument in this video. Well, said one YouTube commenter, the New Testament authors were constrained by their audience, which expected forms akin to that of the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. Now, there's some truth there, but here was my reply. This attributes complex motives to the New Testament authors that we cannot verify. And aren't we in a similar situation? Jesus is a very well-established word in contemporary English. James is too, as are the Lord and Sabbath and countless other standard transliterations or translations of Hebrew words. Why can't we do what the New Testament authors did and use the language around us as it currently stands? Now, I hate anti-Semitism, I do. My wife is part Jewish. Recovering the Jewishness of Jesus and Paul and the neato connection between James, the New Testament writer, and Jacob, the patriarch, that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. But I don't think making people talk differently is the way to execute this recovery. I think insisting on replacing English words or names with Hebrew ones actually cheapens that effort of reconnection by reaching for a theologically undesirable expedient. What do I mean? Many Christians have tried to baptize or sacralize a particular language as the truly righteous or divine language, the tongue of Adam and the angels. This appears to be a natural human tendency. Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and English have all been given such treatment. Literally yesterday, someone insisted to me that God inspired the Elizabethan English of the King James Version because God knew that English would become the lingua franca of the world. But the mere fact that our term for widely used interlanguage once meant language of the French ought to remind us that languages rise and fall with the empires to which they're attached. Okay, so it's a little more complicated than that footnote here. Lingua franca was once a literal trade pigeon in the Mediterranean that included elements of multiple languages, though strangely not actually French. Latin had a huge influence because the Roman Empire was so powerful. But even Rome did not remain top canus. God doesn't have a favorite language. He didn't pick one to be the one lang to rule them all. One of the reasons God chose Abraham in the first place, or so he said, was so that he might bless all the families of the earth, whatever their languages are. If God has a favorite family, and for his own loving reasons, he does, Deuteronomy 7, 6 through 8, it's the Jews. But even that fact doesn't cause their language to be holy. The Lord did not chide the Jews for losing Hebrew as their daily language while they were exiles in Babylon. He didn't ask Nehemiah or Ezra to reestablish Hebrew upon their return to the land. He did not inspire the New Testament writers to write in Hebrew. The Bible is multilingual, and so is God, more than anyone else in the history of the universe. God can speak your language, whatever it is. However you say James or Jesus or Jehovah in your language, keep on trucking, man. God hears and understands. I'm not tossing charges of racism around here. I'm not saying that defenders of Hebrew are philo-Semitic to some kind of ultranationalist degree. That's not the feel I get. I would say the same of defenders of Latin and Greek. It's a religious thing. It's the impulse that led one old immigrant to argue that her Swedish Baptist church, this is a true story, it's a church in the U.S., should not move to English. She objected, "You never heard of anyone being converted in English." She said that in Swedish, of course. Or maybe it's the magical and superstitious view that to have the real name of something is to have some kind of control over it or access to it. I'm not unwilling to learn a religious patois if that's what God demands. I'm a native speaker of American evangelical Protestant lingo. But aside possibly from some technical terms like church and elder, which gain their meaning from the nexus of meaning created by Christ when he founded the church, God has not asked us to learn a special religious way of talking. And Tyndale's plowboy lives at the center of my heart. If he comes into our assemblies and hears weirdo language, he's gonna think we're crazy. That's 1 Corinthians 14, 23 through 25. I admit that I would not complain too much if Jacob ultimately replaced James. That's not the point for me. And I acknowledge that some amount of usage policing by the elite seems to be a natural part of the way humans interact with each other and with language. I'm doing it myself in this video, even by defending the English status quo. But there's a fine line between advocating for a linguistic standard and engaging in ideological language engineering. I fear that the latter, though from good-hearted people, is driving the Hebraicization campaign that I see slowly growing in force online. Take it from teacher Marcus Meadow Guard Youth.